All right, so this is going to be episode 3 of the Exposé VGC, and this episode is going to be about the roll chart. All right, so episode 2 covered class chart and how basically classes are role are battle styles within roles. If I didn't describe it as that, and they basically are what decides basically how your Pokemon influences your team. Right? That's like the best way of simplifying it. All right, so roles are essentially more subcategories. That's like I'd say roles are probably the subcategory um right under types. Right, it's the more like defined subcategory after types. Right, and they're basically kind of best way to describe roles. I'd say um is that they're the part of the Pokemon that helps you make decisions, right, with the Pokemon. Right? So that's the best way I can describe it. And so that's just what you should keep in mind if you're watching this video is that roles are the part of the Pokemon that help you make decisions with the Pokemon. All right. So we're gonna cover we're gonna have 4 charts for this video. So definitely should get into it. And yeah, so keep that in mind when you're watching this video, and I hope you enjoy. All right. So first role we're gonna cover is Brute. It's the roles I should probably cover the first. Makes the most sense to cover. And Brute is basically your like dedicated fighter, right? Second, let me get my mats. All right. All right. So your Brute is your dedicated fighter. Yes. All right. So there's four subcategories of brutes, right? Um, so you have game knowledge brutes. That's what I call them, right? You have skill check brutes, right? You have skill ceiling brutes, and then you have reset brutes, right? So the description for each of them is that so for the game knowledge brute, I describe it as that they capitalize on game knowledge differences. Skill check brute capitalizes on skill differences. Skill ceiling brute capitalizes on mastery differences. Then the reset brute capitalizes on stat differences. All right. So if you play a lot of like uh battle RPG games, right, you're pretty familiar kind of with classes of fighters, right? But a lot of battle RPGs that are popular, uh, besides Pokemon, of course, don't really aren't really honest with how they design their characters. So these are uh qualities of fighters that are pretty familiar with people, but because of how dishonest a lot of uh battle RPGs are with making their characters, basically seems like the characters are not really able to be uh simplified right into a specific role, right? And so as a result, you get a lot of pretty much mystification when it comes to understanding uh roles in Pokemon in particular, right? Um, Pokemon again is not uh guilty of that. What I just described, right? Where they're basically um making basic very ambiguous fighters, right? Um, so you know, for someone to explain that fighters in Pokemon can be categorized into specific roles may seem a bit unfamiliar, but again, right? Pokemon is really striving to make a game, right? Whereas a lot of these battle RPGs that are popular are really just trying to make online communities and less games, right? And so, yeah. All right. So, I won't labor that point too much. So let me just continue with this. So, yeah. So let me explain kind of more in depth, sort of kind of what these descriptions mean, and then what these subcategories are, right? So your game knowledge brutes, these are generally those characters that are going to be like, you know, very uh introductory, right? And so they're going to be very, simple, but usually their downside is that um they're strong early, right? I'll just use the arrows to describe strong, right? And then they're weak late, right? So this will mean weak, right? So once your opponent can really get their board set up, right? These characters usually become very weak. Right. So I'll give you some Pokemon. So some examples of game knowledge roots would be like in this generation particularly, probably the best example is Godango, right? Godango uh has a lot going for it, right? Very good offensive type and then a very good defensive type, right? And then the ability good in gold, and then make it rain, right? 120 base power, special skill move, right? That hits both targets, right? It lowers your special attack by one stage, right? So it's a very powerful Pokemon, right? But again, right after you use Make It Rain, special attack drops by one stage, right? So you become a significantly weaker Pokemon after you use Make It Rain, right? And so you have this very simple introductory character that's very good early, right, and very weak late, right? But again, right, if you're able to really capitalize, right, like I said, right, capitalize on game knowledge differences, right, you could really get a lot of mileage out of Godengo, right? Another good example would be something like Scizor, right? Kind of similar concept, right? Scizor, well, this one doesn't have uh technician, but I'll just give technician right now. But so, well, light metal, so stupid. Uh, I'll just reset my game, but it's fine. Um, so yeah, Scizor, has technician, right, and has bullet punch, right, which is boosted by technician, right, and then in some generations, right, it gets bug bite, right, 60 base power bug move, right. In this generation, it doesn't have it, right, but you have like Fury Cutter. You want to be edgy, but you get the point, right? Um, very strong early game attack, bullet punch, right? Already gets the technician boost, and then it gets the same type of attack bonus boost as well, right? And then Scizor has like 130 attack, right? So it's going to be a very powerful move, right? But to get Scizor, you know, able to take over a game, right? You really have to, again, right, capitalize on game differences, game knowledge differences, right? So the reason I describe it like that is because it makes it seem like these characters suck, right? And again, in a lot of battle RPGs, these characters are generally pretty unpopular, right? And it's because again, right, these characters in other battle RPGs are not very honestly designed, right? And so you get a lot of janky stuff with them, right? Whereas in Pokemon, stuff like Godengo and Scizor, it's pretty cut and dry, right? That they're not going to, be able to do anything stupid, right? So, yeah, that's game knowledge brutes, right? I'll just reset my game because whatever. It's just an ability patch. Well, two ability patches is a lot. Let me just reset it. All right, so yeah, that's game knowledge brutes, right? So underneath here, I have another section called power grade, and power grade uh basically is measure of the fighter's power, right? Of power, right? And so, Here for power grade, I describe it as high power, low range, right? And by low range, again, I mean basically what I was saying: strong early, and then weak late, right? And then high power, of course, has reference to its strong early game, right? So next we have skill check brutes, right? Skill check brutes are described as having capitalizing on skill differences, right? So in this case, and I described them in the power grade as having high power and then high difficulty, right? So in this case, what skill check brutes, right? You have these characters um that, and again, it's very hard to really pinpoint them into other battle RPGs because again, these characters are just kind of incomprehensible in other battle RPGs, right? But yeah, I described them as having high power and high difficulty, right? And so essentially, what you have with these skill check brutes, these are these type of characters, right, where your opponent has to, be familiar, you know, with kind of what they're up against, right? Otherwise, you can really capitalize on that, right? So, give you some examples, some skill check brutes, right? So, a good example of a skill check brute would be something like a dragon, right? So, a dragon, right? Pseudo legendary from Generation 5, right? If you're familiar with a dragon from Generation 5, right? Generation 5, uh, there was no fairy type, and then steel moves, steel Pokemon did not resist dark, right? And so I think Dark Dragon was nothing could resist it, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, nothing resisted the Dark Dragon uh type combination, right? And so what you had was a Pokemon where you're not very familiar with it, right? Like I described, um, then you'll be able, then you can capitalize on that, right? Or rather, if you're not familiar with it, your opponent can capitalize on that, right? So that's a good example of a skill check brute. Um, none else come to mind, so we'll just cover skill stealing brutes, right? So skill stealing brutes, and yeah, how I describe it is high power, high difficulty, right? And yeah, uh, again, right? Their power, right? They have a very high power, right? And uh, that power is balanced by their high difficulty, right? So in the case of game knowledge brutes, they have high power, but their power is balanced by their weakness in the late game. And then for skill check brutes, they have high power, and their power is balanced by their difficulty, basically, right? So with game knowledge boosts, what you'll notice, right, is that when you're playing them, you're gonna win a lot of early games, but then in the late game, you're gonna start, the Pokemon that you've been relying on is going to start, it's gonna seem like it's failing you, right? And it's not necessarily because it's failing you, because again, right, it's not designed to be powerful in the late game, right? For skill check routes, what you'll notice is that, you'll feel extremely powerful, right? You look at the stats, like Hydreigon, for example, has 600 base stat total, right? And you'll be like, oh man, this Pokemon's just going to carry me, right? And you're gonna find that you're just gonna be getting blown up, basically, right? And it's because if you're not very familiar with it, then you're not gonna be able to utilize it, right? So yeah, that's kind of what you'll notice with these types of brutes, right? So next category of skill ceiling brute is probably the most complicated. It's the skill ceiling brute, right? And I describe it as capitalizing on mastery differences, right? So it may seem like mastery, you know, and skill are basically the same, right? But skill in this case is basically right, like your your own skill level, right? So skill is your own skill level, right? And then mastery is more like your familiarity with the character itself, right? So that's the distinction between mastery and skill in this case, right? So kind of explain a little more, right? With skill check brutes, you could, not play the character a lot, right? But just because you're really good at the game, you could get away with it, right? With a skill ceiling brute, it doesn't matter how good you are at the game, right? If you're not very familiar with the character, then you're not going to be able to get away with it compared to with a skill check brute, right? So, uh, yeah. So for skill ceiling brute, the power grade I describe it as is high power and low agency, right? So what I mean by that is that you basically have these class of brutes that are basically like um they're basically like very obviously they're dedicated fighters like I described, um but in this case they require a lot of execution in order to really get their power, right? So you're not going to just be able to just bring out a skill ceiling brute and then just take over a game, right? Just pressing random buttons. You're going to need to be very, you're going to have a lot of you're going to need a lot of foresight, basically, right? And so, kind of explain it. I'll show you a skill ceiling brute to sort of uh, highlight what I'm trying to explain here. So, skill ceiling brute would be something like, if I remember correctly, something like something like uh, something like Quacklevool. Yeah. So Quacklevool, uh, so something like Quacklevool is a very good example, right? Because with Quacklevool, right, you have the ability Moxie, right, and then you have a signature move Aqua Step, right, and so this Pokemon is very good, right, at doing a lot of damage, right, but in this case, it's a very it's a very skillful uh set of decisions you have to make, right, to really get a lot of value out of it, right? So you have like Aqua Step, which increases your speed, and then you have like Moxie, which increases your attack, right? And so you have to calculate all these things in advance, right, before making decisions, right? So you can get value out of it, right? So it's not just something where you're just gonna bring it down; it's just gonna take over, right? So that's the low agency part, right? You don't really have a lot of choice in the decisions you can make. You really have to be very decisive, right, with this Pokemon, right, in order to get a lot of value out of it, right? So that's your skill ceiling boots, right? And so it's I describe it as skill ceiling, right, because it's essentially how uh basically how much ahead you can basically plan for it to get value out of it, right? So again, this is more introductory, so don't take this, take this with a grain of salt, right? But yeah, that's kind of skill ceiling, all right? All right, so the last brute is reset brutes, right? And I described them as having as capitalizing on stats differences, right? And so in this case, reset brutes in the power grade, I described them as having high stats and low power, right? So as opposed to all the other brutes, right, which are very powerful in general, right? Reset brutes generally just have high stats, right? But it gets balanced out by their low power, right? So it's very similar to game knowledge brutes, but in the case of reset brutes is actually the opposite, right? So game knowledge brutes they have a strong early and a weak late. Resets brutes have weak early and then a strong late, right? It's not really like a very accurate way of describing it, but just to kind of simplify it, I'll just put it like that, right? So yeah, reset brutes generally are characterized by having very high power, right? And I mean very high stats, right, but very low power, right? And I describe them as reset brutes because they have to capitalize on stat differences, right? And so sort of like a skill ceiling brute where you have to plan a lot in advance. Reset brutes reset brutes are like more simple versions of skill ceiling brutes. If another kind of way to simplify it. So reset brutes need to have a very good stat difference. They have to have a really good stat difference, right, compared to the Pokemon they're up against, in order to get a lot of value for them. And I'll use a reset brute to explain this, right? So a nice reset brute would be something like Heracross, for example, right? So Heracross, right, has guts, right, and basically guts when you have a status condition, right, like a burn, paralyzed, or poison, right, your attack stat gets doubled, right? So Heracross, when it's burned, right, in this case it has a flame orb, so it's gonna be burned mostly, right? It's gonna have double attack, right? So you're gonna be able to, do a lot of damage, right? But since the damage is just isn't really getting modified a lot, right? Except by your stats, um, you're gonna have to, basically hit a lot of either very low HP Pokemon or very weak Pokemon, right? And that's why I describe it as reset, right? In the sense that you need to get these sort of like resets, basically, right? Where you're basically killing Pokemon in succession, right? Because generally you're not strong unless you're, killing Pokemon, right? Hence reset. And resets are generally described. That's generally how they're described in battle RPGs, right? Getting resets, right? And generally these characters, that's what they're notorious for, right? So that's reset brutes, right? So yeah, that's brutes, right? So we have three more categories, right? So next category we're gonna cover. Actually, cover this last. Cover Guardians next. So Guardians are basically your it's your dedicated help, right? Right. So there's three classes of Guardians. You have damage modifier Guardians, right? You have health modifier Guardians, and then you have aura Guardians, right? So I describe damage modifier Guardians as modifying damage, health modifier Guardians as modifying health, and aura Guardians as modifying the board, right? So in this case, uh, the second section for these class of fighters is stat profiles, right? So for damage modifiers, Guardians, they have even stats, even combat power, right? So they're generally just like, sort of similar to game knowledge brutes, right? Where they're just kind of balanced fighters, right? Then you have health modifier Guardians that have high stats and low combat power, right? So generally, these characters are going to have a lot of health, right? Because they're going to need to stay alive to support, the other characters beside it. But as a result, they're not going to be very powerful, right? And then Aura Guardians have high stats and high combat power, right? But they just have low modifying power, right? So all their power goes into their fighting, sort of, and then they can't really do anything else, right? And I'll show some Pokemon to explain this, right? So I described damage modifier Guardians as modifying damage, right? But let me just segue into something else here. So damage modifier Guardians, right? And also just the Guardian class, right? This dedicated help class, as I describe it, very hard to really understand outside of Pokemon because again, right, this class usually can pretty much do everything, right? When it comes to uh, you know, guarding, right, your teammates, right? In other battle RPGs, right? So it's very hard to really understand that, these characters can be, basically, put into a specific role category, right? So yeah, I'll use some Pokemon to really explain kind of the fact that again, as opposed to other battle RPGs, these characters can be put into specific role categories, and they don't just have to do everything, right? So for damage modifier, generally modifying damage, right? And what that means is you're going to be lowering stats, right? Particularly, attack and special attack, right? And then special attack, right? So that's generally so that would be for your opponent, right? What you could also do is you can increase stats as well, right? For your teammates, right? Right? And then this is your opponent, right? So that's generally what damage modifier gradients are trying to do, right? And so the way to balance that is obviously just making them basically just even stats, even combat power, right? So use a damage modifier guardian to illustrate this, right? So the damage modifier guardian would be something like Stone Joiner, for example, right? So Um, Stone Joiner. Well, actually, Stone Joiner is not a damage modifier. Sorry, something like Golduck, for example, right? So Golduck, um, Golduck, yeah, Golduck. Actually, something like Latias. Latias would probably be a better example. Golduck is a little more mystified to explain. So Latias, right? Obviously, is a counterpart to Latios, right? And so Latias, its signature move, right? So sort of when you're looking to sort of classify Pokemon into roles, you have to look for clues within their move pools, type ins, uh, abilities, stats, etc. Right? So for Latias, obviously Latias is kind of extreme because obviously it's a legendary Pokemon, so its stats are much better than the average Pokemon. But Latias has a signature move, Miss Ball, right? 95 base power special psychic move. I think has a 50% chance to lower the target special attack by one stage, right? So Latias would be trying to basically lower the stats of opposing Pokemon, right? So if you're familiar with Latios, Latios is the more offensive version, and then Latias is the more defensive, right? So something like Latias, right? Yeah. Golduck's a little more mystified. I was gonna use Golduck, but Golduck can play a lot of roles, so it's very hard to really kind of use it as an example here. So again, this is also just a very introductory video. So I don't want to get too complicated. So yeah, something like Latias, right? So that's damage modifier guardians. Health modifier guardians generally health modify health, right? And I'm going kind of quickly here because I just want to keep this video within an hour. So just bear with me, right? So health modifier guardians modify health, right? And so uh again, it's kind of similar, same thing as damage modifier guardians. So whether generally health modifier guardians are going to be increasing your generally going to be healing your team, right? That's generally the best way to look at it. Don't want to get too complicated here, right? So yeah, that's generally what health modifiers are going to be doing, right? And obviously, healing your teammates is pretty powerful, right? So to compensate for that, they generally have low combat power, right? And they're generally not going to be able to have a lot of combat power because they're going to need stats to stay alive as well, right? Hence high stats, right? So, um, good Pokemon to explain this do something like Poltergeist. I mean, Sinistra rather. Sinistra has the ability Hospitality, right? When it comes in, heals your ally by 25%. And then it has moves like Life Dew and Rage Powder, right? Which generally, help with your partner's vitality, right? So, right, pretty simple to understand, right? And then this one, obviously, HP special effects, right? Keep it alive, right? So that's health modifier guardians. Then aura guardians are actually kind of the coolest guardians, in my opinion. Uh, so aura guardians have modified the board, right? And so as opposed to damage modifier guardians, right, and health modifier guardians, right? Aura guardians are not actually targeting your team, right? They're not targeting your team. They're actually targeting the board, right? So better job with that check mark. So yeah, so that's generally what they're going to be doing, right? And since uh board targeting support, right, generally pretty fixed in terms of what it can do, right? to balance that out, they generally have very high stats and very high combat power, right? And so you have these types of Pokemon. I'll use some Pokemon as an example, right? So you have these Pokemon that just seem so powerful, right? And it's because they're these Aura Guardians, right? So you have Pokemon like Rillaboom, right, with Grassy Surge, right? So Grassy Surge puts a terrain on the board, right? And in that case, that'd be the Aura, right? You have Pokemon like Kyogre, right, with Drizzle, summons rain when it comes in, right? Then obviously Groudon, right, with Drought, right? Pokemon like Koraidon, right, with Orichalcum Pulse, right? These Pokemon have very high stats and they're very powerful, right? They seem like they don't do anything else, right? And that's of course because they fall under this category of Aura Guardian, right? Right. So that's what I mean. Also by the low modifying power is that auras again they have very fixed modifying powers. So in order to balance the Aura Guardians, they need to have high stats and high combat power. Right. So that's Guardians. Right. So then we'll get into the third category, which is tanks. Right. So tanks, these are like your dedicated walls. Right. Generally, how we describe high stat, Pokemon. I mean, high stat fighters rather, in RPGs, right? In English, right? We describe them as walls, right? So tanks are dedicated walls, right? So three categories of target of tanks, right? So we have target selection tanks, modifier tanks, and vanguard tanks, right? I described them. Target selection tanks picks targets, modifier tanks modifies targets, and then vanguard tanks protects targets. Right. So in this case, so we've had power grade, we've had stat profiles, and so for this section, they have objectives, right? Tanks have objectives, right, that they're trying to uh complete, right? So for target selection tanks, their objectives is that they want to kill targets that threaten them, right? For modifier tanks, they want to weaken targets that threaten them, right? And then vanguard tanks want to take attacks that threaten them, right? So how to explain this? So for target selection tanks, they pick targets, right? So this is elaborated more in the objective section, right? They kill targets that threaten it, right? So of course tanks, these are again, right? These are your dedicated walls, right? They're designed, they just take a lot of damage, right? So generally, again, right, tanks are a very hard concept to understand for battle RPGs because again, these tanks that we see in other battle RPGs, right, not Pokemon, are very dishonest, right? Of course, they either are very good at taking a certain type of damage, or they're just able to do everything, basically, right? And so, yeah, to be able to just categorize tanks into a single category or a specific category rather, um, seems very unfamiliar outside of Pokemon, right? But I'll use some Pokemon to elaborate on this, right? So target selection tanks, they pick targets, right? Their objective is to kill targets that threaten it, right? So I'll use some tanks as an example here. So target selection tank, something like Lugia, right? Lugia has multi-skill, right, which reduces the damage it takes when set. uh, full HP by half, right? And then it has just incredibly high tank stats, right? It has like 154 special defense. I think it has 130 defense, right? And then it has like 90 HP or something like that, right? And so Lugia seems like, as a tank, it seems pretty underwhelming, right? Because besides the fact that it can tank a lot of hits, it's not really doing anything else, right? And it's not because, right, Lugia is just a bad tank or something like that. Because Lugia is trying to kill targets that threaten it so that once those targets are taken out, then it can do tanky things, right? Tanking hits that wouldn't do a lot of damage to it, right? So this Lugia has Calm Mind, right? So that generally the targets that you want to kill are special Pokemon, right? Because you're going to be increasing your special attack and special defense, right? So that you can kill a special Pokemon, right? That would threaten your team, right? So that's target selection picks, right? So modifier tanks, um, they modify targets, right? So in the objective section, I describe it as weakened targets that threaten it, right? So this is pretty straightforward, right? So as opposed to something like Lugia, right? You're just trying to kill a target with high stats by increasing your stats by a lot and then killing the target. Modifier tanks are more supportive tanks, right? Something like Gudra, right? Where Gudra is able to have moves like Scald and Acid Spray, right? Where Scald burns your target and Acid Spray lowers his special defense, right? So it can take a more supportive role as opposed to Lugia, which is trying to take more of a dominated role, right? So that's modifier tanks. Then Vanguard tanks are described as protecting targets, right? And in the description, and in the objective section, describe it as taking attacks that threaten it, right? So this seems like what tanks just do, right? But in this case, that's what Vanguard tanks are trying to do, right? So Vanguard tank would be like something like Bastiodon, right? So Bastiodon has 30, right? Bastiodon has wide guard, right? So generally, it's going to be able to take uh, moves that can target multiple Pokemon, right? Probably another Pokemon that'd be easier to simplify this would be something like Gastrodon, right? Gastrodon has Storm Drain, right? So what you can do with Vanguard tanks, right, to get a little more in depth here, is that you don't have to have them on the board. You can have a Pokemon, right, that could bait an attack that a Vanguard tank would be able to eat, right? For example, if you have like a Heat Ran out that's weak to water, you can have Gastrodon in the back, right? Bait the water move, bring in Gastrodon, and then it eats the water move, right? That's generally how something like Gastrodon will work. Something as opposed to Bastiodon. Bastiodon can do the same thing, right? Where it has 30, right? If you're going to take a huge hit, you can just bring it in, and then Bastiodon can eat it with 30, right? Then you can start pressing White Guard, and then all that stuff, right? So that's tanks, right? So the last category we're going to cover is Trickies. And I wanted to cover it last because it's actually the most mystified class of fighters, right? So Trickies are your dedicated cares, right? They are trying to, and again, this is a very mystified concept, right? Because in a lot of battle RPGs, right, you have these quote unquote, you know, let me just really emphasize this. You have these carries, right, that basically can't be stopped, right, once they get going, right? And that's not necessarily what a carry is supposed to do. Again, these are very dishonest characters, right? And so when I use the term carry, right, you're gonna think of all these characters, right, that are just basically unstoppable, right? And that's not how carries work, right? So carries are basically trying to gain you stuff, right? That's what carries do. So just keep that in mind when I'm describing this. So carries are not, again, right? They're not just trying to do everything and just be unstoppable. They're just trying to gain you stuff, right? So that is a tricky category as well, right? And so there's three types of trickies, right? So you have your agency trickies, you have your gambit trickies, and then you have opportunistic trickies, right? So agency trickies, and then right, I describe them as agency trickies have gain agency, gambit trickies gain options, and then opportunistic trickies gain advantages, right? And then so for this section, we've had power grade, we've had stat profiles, had objectives, and then in this case we have value grade, right? So I describe their value grade, right? Basically, what I mean by value grade is the measure, right, of the value you gain from them, right? But ultimately, these characters are tricky, right? And so they're not necessarily just gonna like brutes, for example, just come out and just do a lot of damage. You're gonna have to do a lot of calculating in order to get a lot of value from them, right? So in this case, I use equations, right? And again, this is introductory, so I'm not going to get too deep into these equations. But for this case, agency tricky, you can measure the value by timeout times value gained, right? They're very specific symbols I use here. Uh, so yeah, timeout is basically just how long the Pokemon is out on the board, or the fighter rather, and then value gained is how much value you gained from having it on the board, right? Which, and again, this is just introductory, so take this with a grain of salt, right? Then Gambit Tricky, the equation I use to determine the value grade is reward divided by chance, right? So the reward generally is already determined, right, by the tricky you're using. And then the chance is just basically the chance of you getting the reward, right? So again, this is like your constant, right? What I highlight here, and then chance, which is a percentage, obviously, right? And then you have opportunistic trickies. The equation I use is power of advantage times plus value gain, right? So again, it's kind of similar to gambit trickies, right? Where they have an advantage they're trying to gain, right? And basically, you measure the value grade, right? Is measured by how much value you gain from the advantage you took, right? So I'll get into this pretty quickly. So for agency trickies, they gain agency, right? So timeout times value gained. So I'll use a Pokemon to highlight this, right? So good agency tricky would be something like Blaziken, right? So Blaziken's an agency tricky, right? It has the ability speed boost, right? So the longer it's out, right, the faster it gets, right? Then it can be run physical or it can be run special, right? Generally, you're gonna want to run special because it moves like Swords Dunk and bulk up, right? Then basically you're measuring um basically how much legwork you can get out of Blaziken, right? With all the boosts that you get, and then detect, and again focus sash as well, right? So yeah. So then you have gambit trickies, right? You're getting options, right? So again, it's measured by reward divided by chance, right? So use a gambit tricky to highlight this. So a good gambit tricky would be something like Rotom, right? So Rotom has all these signature moves, right? Depending on which Rotom you're using, right? So Rotom Heat in this case has Overheat, right? So Overheat has 90 base accuracy, right? So again, right, very powerful move, right? Also lowers your special attack by 2 stages, but it has 90 accuracy, right? And so your opponent basically just has to, basically try to um guess, how much value you're gonna get from using Overheat, right? So that's essentially kind of what the gambit is, right? So you're gonna use Overheat, and it can hit, right, and do a lot, or it can miss, or it could, basically put a Pokemon on the board with -2 special attack, right? All this stuff, right? And that's essentially what it means by, gambit, right? Then you have your opportunistic trickies. They gain advantages, right? And then I measure it by power of advantage plus value gained, right? And so, good example, this would be something like Gardevoir, right? So Gardevoir has the ability to trace, right? So you'll be able to take Pokemon's ability, right? That's the advantage you gain, right? And then basically how much value you can get out of, for example, in this case, taking an ability, right? So that's basically uh what's it called? Uh Opportunistic trickies, right? So those are 4 classes. I mean 4 roles rather. So again, this is introductory, so take this with a grain of salt, right? And I'll show you the sample team to basically highlight sort of how uh, roles play a part, right, on your team, right? So this team here is Wigglytuff, Electivire, Mabostiff, um, Blaziken, Octopex, and Heracross, right? So Wigglytuff, right, is a target selection tank, and Electivire is um, a skill check brute, right? Uh, Mabostiff, right, is a game knowledge brute. Blaziken again is a agency tricky, and then Toxapex is the Vanguard tank, and Heracross is a reset, right? So you have 3 brutes on this team, right? Uh, you have Electivire, Mabostiff, and Heracross. Then you have 2 tanks, right? A Vanguard tank, right? Something you can switch into attacks. And then you have a target selection tank in Wigglytuff that is able to, kill threatening targets, right? So what this what Wigglytuff does in this case is it gives you a Pokemon that you can open very freely, right? Because since it's gonna be able to threaten a lot of Pokemon, you can just bring it out whenever, right? And then you have Toxapex in the back in case Wigglytuff can't do that, right? So that's the end of this episode. So I'm gonna get more deeper into this in the last episode for this series, which is gonna be called Team Analysis, right? And so I'll just leave that there, food for thought. And thank you for listening. And I hope to see you in the next video.